Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey everybody, it's Adam here, your host of the FigureItOutcast. We are here for March 2020. And as always, thank you to the big shout out to the Patreon backers who make this podcast possible, as well as keep the channel afloat. Much appreciate you. There's going to be a link in the description to all the subjects that are in particular this episode, and you can check timecode therein to go to skip around to ones you do or do not want to hear, or whatever you want to do. But yeah, thank you to them. So if you're hearing this early, it's because you're a Patreon backer, and if you're hearing this when it came out in its public release, awesome. Thank you very much for listening. At any time, if you want, you can go over and sign up. That's completely up to you, and much appreciated. Now, so let's go ahead, just to finish that off real quick. If you want, you can actually be on this podcast, you can pick subjects, or you can get shout outs, as will happen later. But okay, moving on. Let's get into it here. We got a bunch of subjects, and I want to kind of cover some of them, or, you know, hopefully all of them. First and foremost, this is breaking news at the time I'm actually recording this. The Nintendo PlayStation prototype has sold at auction for a whopping $360,000. Now, I've done multiple videos on the Nintendo PlayStation prototype, so I'll just kind of do the recap here real quick. Basically, in the late 80s, early 90s, Nintendo and Sony were coming together. They were going to make an attachment for the Super Nintendo, which was going to be called the PlayStation. And then it would have been its own standalone thing, kind of like the Sega CDX a little bit, and then probably eventually evolved into a new brand of console that Nintendo and Sony were doing together. Ultimately, the whole thing fell through for various reasons. Like I said, I've done a bunch of videos on this. But as a result of that, what ultimately happened is Nintendo went off and made the N64, and they just ditched ditched CDs for a generation. Sony went off with kind of what they had learned in the industry and decided we really do want to be in video games, and they made the PlayStation that we all know. And there were 200 of the Nintendo PlayStation CD-ROM unit prototypes, the one that you've seen commonly around the internet. 200 of those were apparently built. Sony ordered them all destroyed. 199 of them were, one was not. The one that survived went to the office of a guy named Olaf Olafsson. He was the first president of PlayStation. And a few years back, he basically had an estate sale, and his stuff was auctioned off, Storage Wars style, and it just so happens that one of the boxes contained the Nintendo PlayStation prototype, and it ended up in the bidder's hand, which was a guy named Terry Diebold. Terry Diebold has been the owner of the console since then. I think he says it was in like the late 90s when that happened. So yeah, he had it ever since then, and only a few years ago realized, you know, really what it was. It was ultimately repaired and restored by my buddy Ben Heck, who said that it could have been in better shape when he got it. He was like, the problem was nobody knew what it was, so it had been stored poorly. So where it was sitting in the sun and in the heat for years, and it had kind of melted all the caps, or at least damaged them. So he went in and just did a lot of work to ultimately repair it, but it was up and running eventually. And then Terry took it around the world, touring with it, showing it to people, and finally towards the end, its last public appearance was at Portland Retro Game Expo 2019 in October of 2019. Because Terry's a buddy of mine, I've been to many conventions with him. He was cool enough to let me kind of have the final video about it. So we shot this video, which is up on my channel. It's been out for months now. I sit down with Terry and I do not only a review of the console as if it had kind of come out, talk, you know, about its history, but also his story, like everything he kind of did with it and where it was all going. And then it had its last day on the con floor where people could go and play it for the last time. And he actually would let me rig it all up. You know, I had actually set it up with, you know, some HD Retrovision cables, a Retro Tank, an M Classic, all this stuff, just to kind of, you know, push it and see what you could get out of this thing, because I kind of figured after that it's over. Like, nobody's really gonna be able to look at it for much. And so I got to set it up, and ultimately, when the con was ending, I was sitting there playing it. I was playing Super Mario Kart, and it was like, okay, wrap it up, we're done. So I was the last person to ever play it publicly, because I even have footage of that moment. It's in my video. You know, I was playing it, and then I end up being the one who, you know, basically disconnected it and put it in that bag, and then it was not reactivated or played, at least publicly, since then. I mean, since then its possession has been with Terry, and then down in Houston at Heritage Auctions. They were the guys who were responsible for ultimately selling it, and they've just kind of had it there. So it just like at the time I record this, like this just ended. I was talking to Terry. He was watching a live feed of it, and it sold ultimately for $360,000. Now Terry doesn't get a full $360,000 for people who are curious about that. 60,000 of it goes to Heritage Auction. So if you ever think like eBay punishes you, like damn. But yeah, so he gets 300,000, but then you got to pay taxes on that, and then I know he's got just other things he's got to do with it, former marital things, and debts and so on and so forth. So Terry was just in a place where it was time. He had to do this. And I know a lot of people bring up the museum thing, and as cool as that would be, the guy who bought it is, I think, one of the guys who created Oculus Rift, and he made some claim about being, super into history. I don't think it's going to like go in his cabinet. I think he's going to do something special with it, probably as some sort of display piece. Yeah, so it's one of these things where I was all over the map on what this thing might have sold for. It did end up becoming the most expensive item ever sold in video games. It's official now. Like, that is the most expensive thing ever sold at a video game auction of any kind. $360,000 for a single item. I mean, technically it's got a controller in that boot cart, but really, yeah, it's all just one package deal. And the previous was like a sealed copy of Super Mario Brothers 3 for NES, like in flawless condition. For some reason, sold at 100,000, but maybe because it was like the only one left of that caliber on Earth. But I don't know the specifics of that. But in this case, yeah, it shatters that record. Very unique item, obviously, and I'm gonna miss seeing it on tour. Just because it's such I really like history. In case that isn't obvious, especially video game history. So it's gonna be sad for me to see it go, but it is what it is. At least I got to have my time in the sun with it. I got a lot of photos of me holding it. I think I even I licked it once, which that's where the extra value came in. That, or it went way down because of that. But like I was about to say, I've been all over the place on as far as the value of this thing. I've been asking people like, what do you think? Some people were thinking it would do like $1 million money. Like some people were saying as high as maybe 1.5, even $2 million. And then some people were like, dude, it's not even gonna crack 100K. So it obviously didn't come anywhere near $1 million. But 360,000 as your final bid, not bad. It's one of those things where there's a ton of us that would love to have it, but who has $360,000 liquid that they can just be like, yeah, that's fine, I'll just dump that on, let's keep it real, just a prototype of a console. It's basically a Super Nintendo made by Sony that has its own proprietary disc format that was never really used. Interestingly, I was just hanging out with Ben Heck not too long ago, and I'll get back to that in a bit. But he was talking about it because he had more time to play with the innards than anybody else, and he said like that thing was comically underpowered. The CD drive. He's like, if their goal was to compete with the Sega CD, they didn't even come to half of that. So he's like, I think if he told me, he's like, I think if it had come out, it would have just been anemic and totally unusable anyway. So he's like, it's just kind of funny that it ends up being so like valuable and strange, but it's really because of the history behind it that makes it so interesting. But yeah, so, good on Terry. He's out. He gets to, I'm not gonna say he's gonna retire on a beach, because I know that this is really not gonna do a whole lot for him, surprisingly. But, yeah, so it's I'm curious what the new owner will do with it. Like I said, he claims to be about historical preservation, so it's one of those things where you wonder, like, if someone like a George Lucas or like a Michael Bloomberg or somebody like that was super into video games, like how much higher it could have gone. But the thing, it kind of says something about the retro game market, where something like this is as high as this is apparently our peak in video games. Not only retro video games, but video games in general. This is the single peak of any item, is this particular item. And when you compare it to, say, like sports memorabilia and some of those, like, rare baseball cards and Action Comics #1, stuff like that, it's like, it's not even in the same discussion. I feel like the Nintendo PlayStation prototype will be worth a lot more in a few generations. I think right now it's in this awkward phase where we know what it was, but like I don't know. Collecting is a difficult medium, but that said, I don't blame Terry for doing what he did. We'll see. We will see what happens with it ultimately. If the guy just stores it in a locker somewhere, or if he does something special with it. So Either way, it's time. It's been cool to see it, talk about it, know it's true, know it's all legit. And from a personal level, if he ever listens to this, thank you, Terry, for what you did with it, letting the whole world get to go see it, because not a lot of people would have done that. You know, a lot of people think that Terry was making like mad money touring the world, having all his bills paid for him, and he was just on easy street because he just found something. No, he really didn't. He when it comes to all these conventions and things he was doing, his expenses would be covered for the time he was there. His travel would be covered, which is of course nice. I know I get to do that a lot. But when it comes to like any sort of financial incentive, he was never paid for a single appearance save one, which was Missouri Game Con. Just gave him a little bit of cash just to be there. But they were really the only ones that ever did that, according to him. So, you know, I can't really blame Terry for not wanting to continue with that, because he's got bills to pay and he's got stuff to do too. So it's, you know, you can't make money not making money, you know. So good on you, Terry. Congratulations. And yeah, look forward to the future on this thing. And hopefully you guys got to see it at some point or check it out, because it's probably out of the public eye for life now. Anyway, moving on. Our next subject. This is a bit of a, we're going back a little bit. If you watched my channel recently, at the beginning of March 3rd was the Nintendo Switch's 3rd birthday. And I did a video about that. I was a little late with the video because I just upgraded everything to 4K and I wasn't really prepared for how long the render time was going to be on that. That was my bad. But either way, I got the video out. And so one of the points I made in the video was I was talking about what generation the Nintendo Switch falls under. A lot of people want to believe, just because it's modern, that it's somehow the beginning of the 9th generation. And I was making the case that no, it's the 8th generation. It's the 8th gen because generations are largely defined by two things, which is technological advancement and time in which they were released. You kind of have to meet this weird definition of both. The thing with generations is they're not really relevant at the time in which they exist. They're more like relevant to historians. And that was a point I failed to make in the video. Because a lot of people were like, do you even really, does it matter what generation it's in? Like, who cares? And it's like, okay, to be fair, most people who are playing a video game console aren't going to care about that. The reason I was discussing it was just for the historical perspective. And if the first subject of this video didn't make that obvious, I care about video game history. So I'm making the case, and still am, that the Nintendo Switch is the last 8th generation game console, and that either the Xbox Series X or PS5 will be the first 9th generation game console. I support this by saying by the time those consoles are out, the Switch will have been out for nearly 4 years, which is a bit too far of a stretch for a generational break like that. It's not impossible to have that length of time and have a console come in the generation, another console come in the generation, and have it be like much longer than that. That's not impossible. But then the technology has to be on par. That's the other half of the equation. The Switch is anemic even compared to the already existing 8th generation hardware. It will be completely and utterly annihilated, technologically speaking, by the 9th generation hardware. So it fails both definitions of a new generation. So therefore, it truly is not. But yeah, I just wanted to. More of the subject that we're going to be talking about here is, do console generations even matter? Microsoft has publicly been prepping us for years now of just saying, like, we have to move beyond generations. We have to stop thinking about it in those terms. And I agree with that in the now. You know, nobody really cares what generation something is in, other than it's just a marketing thing to be like, this is the new generation of hardware. Like, that's fine. And people were pointing out that I'm looking at it like an archaic model, and that is true. But at the same time, these consoles did come out, they did exist, and they are part of a historical pattern. They're part of history. They're weaved into the fabric of it. So you have to define these borders between when a generation is, only for historical purposes. It doesn't matter that it's a 9th generation console at the time it comes out. It's more like, in hindsight, where did it sit? So it's good to kind of come up with the reasons behind one particular argument so that you are prepared for that when it comes. Now, that said, the thing about generations that's funny, I've noticed over the years, is people seem to interpret them more as a matter of like your opinion as opposed to a fact, which is true of many things in life. But with consoles, it's typically written down as like a fact. This is where it's sat. Sorry, I hit the mic there. So for some reason though, console generations, people like to just spin an opinion on it. And to be fair, I don't make the rules about what console sits where. So until these are actually set in stone, you can only throw out your opinion. I realize that. But with the Switch, I just don't see how you could possibly make a case that it's a 9th generation console. But you know, I guess history will ultimately determine it. But that's where I sit. But you know, these things have, but nerds more nerdy than me, if that's even possible, have made these decisions on where these consoles lay, where that defined border is. Because you can't, the problem with console generations is you can't just like use a one size fits all definition of what a console generation is, because there's always going to be exceptions. If you're saying like, oh, there has to be like, you know, at least 3 years in between the launch of one and another in order for it to be a generation. Well, the problem with that argument is the tail end of a generation is always going to inevitably creep up on the beginning of the next generation. That's just how time works. And you're always going to have some console that fails that definition. So, like, the Apple Pippin is a 5th generation game console. It came out in 98. The Sega Dreamcast is a 6th generation game console. It also came out in 1998. Or, like, the FM Towns Marty came out in, like, 1991. It's a 5th gen game console. While the SNK Neo Geo CD came out in 1994, but is a 4th generation game console. See, you have overlap. So you got time as an issue, but you also have technological prowess. So even though the Neo Geo CD came out much later, it's much less capable than 5th gen machines. Same with Dreamcast versus, say, Apple Pippin or whatever. And the same argument would apply here. Like, the new generation of hardware that's coming up is vastly superior to the stuff that's out now. And that includes the Switch. So I've seen some people argue, no, it's new because it's a portable, like, docked console. We've never seen that before, which first of all is not really true. But at the same time, it's like, oh, it's got HD Rumble, which first of all, Rumble can't have pixels. I've always hated that name. They just use it because it's a good marketing term. But regardless, I just don't. It's not an argument. Like, it's not an argument. I've yet to see like a valid argument for why anyone could consider the Switch an 8th generation game console, other than I just want it to be, and here's a couple of little fickle things. But in the grand scheme, not only does it not apply, who really cares? That's the end of the day. Is the ultimate point I'm making here is console generations are something that really, in the end, only historians and super nerds ultimately care about. And that was a point I admittedly completely failed to make in my video, so I do apologize for not making that clear. I think a lot of people thought I was like dying on the hill of that in the video, which I really was not. But there you go. So, what's your thoughts on that? Do console generations matter? Do you care about video game history? That's why I care. I care about the history of it. I like to, you know, to kind of categorize things and know how we got to where we are. But to a lot of people, that stuff's not important. They just kind of want to do the thing in the now. And to put that in perspective, like for myself, it's something about, like, let's take cars. I'm not a car guy. I don't really think about cars much, and I don't really think about their history that much. Like, it's just like, I want a good car. That's as far, like, I want a Tesla. Never gonna get one, but I want one. But I know the crude basics of like how we got to that point. You know, you had to have seat belts introduced in like, you know, the late 1950s. Before that, you know, you had to have, you know, Ford revolutionized things with the Model T and industry, and then you had to start eventually getting into, you know, better fuel efficiency, and you had to eventually get you know, better safety and more computers on board and all that stuff. Like, there's been incremental improvement. But would I be able to sit here and tell you, like, what's a generation of a car? Absolutely not. And do I even really care? No, I don't. I respect that something happened on a very rudimentary level, but I don't deep dive into it. And to a lot of people, that's how video game generations are. Like, cool, I get that we're here because, you know, the Game Boy introduced portability, or it didn't introduce it, but it revolutionized it. So I, you know, that's why the Switch is cool to me, but I don't really care about the actual evolution of getting from one to the other. And that's how a lot of people feel. So at the end of the day, you got to remember that too. But that's that. So moving on. Next subject here. The Sonic the Hedgehog movie. This is nothing but a more or less a plug for my video. So a bunch of people, I know a lot of people listen to this podcast listening for movie reviews, because this is typically where I cover it. But I did a Sonic the Hedgehog movie review like as a standalone video. And I think a lot of people avoided it because it's over an hour long, and I don't blame them for that. But it's like, how could you talk about that movie for an hour? If you haven't seen it, I recommend checking out that review, because at least the first half of it, like the first half hour, is really about the state of video game movies in the industry and their history leading up to it in general. before you get to the actual film itself. It's not so much, hey, let's spend an hour talking about the minutia of like why Sonic could or could not go fast. We're going to talk about video game movies as a genre and their future and how they got there. Like really what we're just kind of talking about with console generations, but broken down into almost a documentary style of video game movies. So if you've seen the movie, I recommend watching that as well, just to get the opinions and everything leading up to it. But that's up to you. But in case you avoided it just because you're like, dude, I don't want to spend an hour watching you talk about that, know that only about half of it is that, and the other half is the history of the industry. So there you go. Next up, the Sega Pluto. So we're going back around to prototypes. So it's interesting that we're talking about this today. I did a video on this thing too. If you guys don't know, the Sega Pluto was a project Sega was working on where they were making basically a third iteration of the Sega Saturn. And it was a wider body console. It had onboard Netlink capabilities. It was overall a neat device. It was never released. We know now that Sega made 6 of these things. 4 were destroyed, 2 exist. One popped up on assembler forums like back in like 2013, something like that. And the whole world was like, whatever, don't believe you. And then they realized he was telling the truth. It was a real thing. And then a guy I know named Roger just came out. He's like, oh, I have one of those. And everybody's like, yeah, sure you do. And he just showed everybody. Hey, yeah, here it is. And everybody's like, what? And he tried to sell it. It didn't end up working out. And they just kind of put it in a box and just left it alone. And that was it for years. Early this year, I was talking to some people, and I was talking to a guy named Rudy at the Retro Fix in Campbell, California. Cheap shout out there. And he was buddies with Roger. He's like, oh yeah, my buddy owns that thing. If you want to see it, just let me know and I'll have it brought in. So naturally, I accepted that offer, and we did a video about it together. We did the entire like history as far as we knew it at that point. But yeah, there it was, the Sega Pluto. But Roger had no real interest in like doing much else with it. He had brought it to a single convention only like a month earlier in Sacramento called Sac Gamers Expo 2019, which I had actually been at the year before in 2018. And yeah, so he was like, it'd be cool to do more with it, but it needs work. So when he let me just tinker with it, I discovered it had multiple issues. One was the disc tray was didn't seem to work. We didn't really know why, and the controller ports was somewhat damaged, and that was just from the onset. Like, who knows what else was wrong with it underneath. So I was like, tell you what, I'm gonna do you a favor here. So I got a hold of Ben Heck. And like I said before, the guy who restored the Nintendo PlayStation prototype. Long story short, Ben Heck, Roger, and I all went up to Madison, Wisconsin, and we really deep dived into the Sega Pluto. There will be 2 videos about this. One is on Ben's channel, or will be, which is a complete teardown of the console. You can see the whole process of everything under the hood. Mine will be more or less the highlights of that, while also just kind of giving you updates as to what's in it and information about does it do this, does it work with that. Mine will have been filmed across multiple states too. Like, I gotta go the time I record this, I haven't done this yet, but I will be going back to California to test it with a whole bunch of different equipment to see if it supports this, if it supports that. Hopefully learning, like almost doing a review of this console, because obviously no one ever really had the chance to. But I won't spoil anything here, but needless to say, we found it a fascinating little piece of technology. Like, it was very prototypey, as Ben said, but it was also further along than I think any of us really expected it to be. It wasn't just a Sega Saturn Model 2 in a different case. Like, there's actually a lot of different stuff in there. So we're going to push it some more and see what else we can learn about it. But so keep your eyes peeled for that. So that's the end of that subject. Moving on, though, we got a quick round of shout-outs here. The following people are all Patreon backers that support the channel. They're all at the level in which they get a shout-out. Remember, at any time, if you want, you can sign up to get early access to videos just to help the channel out. You can, get a shout-out like they're going to get, or you can, even be on this podcast if you want to. So appreciate you. That is Trey Wagner, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Eric Peralez, and Caleb Bravo. Once again, that is Trey Wagner, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Eric Peralez, and Caleb Bravo. Thank you guys very much. You are all awesome. So moving on to our next subject. This just happened, so by the time most of you hear this, this will be out of date. But at the same time, you know, that's why you get the podcast as quickly as it comes out, if possible. The PS2 just turned 20 years old. Its 20th birthday, I believe, was March 4th, 2020. That was the Japanese launch date, was March 4th, 2000, as opposed to ours, which was like almost a full year later. Or yeah, no, I forget the American launch date. No, maybe it was later in 2000. It was like this. Yeah, no, sorry, it was in 2000. It was later in 2000. The Japanese got it back in March. But yeah, so it I think we got it in the fall of that year. I don't remember offhand, but anyway, so a lot of people are doing their videos about 20 years old, celebrating PS2. I had honestly totally forgotten this was even a thing. I'm going to keep it real with you. But yes, I care about video game history, but you can't remember everything. But yeah, I thought I would do it in here and just kind of talk about some of the highlights. And so my story, I've told it with the PS2, but I'll tell the kind of abridged version here, is I remember when the PS2 was coming out, it was like this big deal because everybody, you know, everybody in, at least that in my circles, if you will, had a PS1. It was like the serious console. Whereas I didn't know anyone with a Sega Saturn. Sorry, Pluto. And N64, you know, people had it, but it was even though it was fun and we all had a lot of fun on it, there was always this, like, I'm gonna say, a secret shame to it. Like, you felt like, as at that age, at least the age I was at the time, I was going into middle school at that point. You were like mentally like, well, I have it in 64, but I don't want to tell anybody that I like Mario because it's kind of embarrassing. So I'm going to tell everybody I like Twisted Metal and I like Sweet Tooth and stuff like that, which was true. I did like those. But what I'm saying is the PlayStation was perceived as more of the adults console. And so when the PlayStation 2 was coming up, there was a lot of hype to be like, oh, dude, this is the next thing. Like, when you get this, you grow up, is just kind of the vibe that it had. And of course, they were pushing DVD technology at the time, which, you know, is obviously archaic now, but at the time it was like, whoa, because DVD exploded into the public lexicon, like into cultural zeitgeist in a way that I don't think any other video format ever did. Like Beta and even VHS never really quite got to the level DVD was. DVD was like meant to be this big technological jump, and it revolutionized things. Laserdisc couldn't do that. It basically did what Laserdisc failed to do, and ultimately what Blu-ray would fail to do. But DVD was just everywhere, and at the time it was like, not only can I get the new game console, I can also upgrade my DVD infrastructure, my video infrastructure, and that was actually a big selling point to most people. Was it was also the cheapest DVD player on the market, and then it just happened to play all your PS1 and PS2 games. But I remember when it came out, it was a struggle, man. Like, I would only play PS1 games, and I would play DVDs on it. There really weren't any games I particularly wanted or enjoyed. I think the first one I got was like Star Wars Starfighter, which later had a better version on the original Xbox. And as the system went on, obviously it exploded in success, and by the end had something like 5,000 games released for it worldwide. In fact, the last game for it, I think, was PES 2014. Pro Evolution Soccer 2014, which would have come out in 2013. So the last PS2 game came out 7 years ago, which is starting to sound longer, but really, when you think about it, the console did launch 20 years ago. So it was around for 13 years, which is pretty impressive. And I know they did, Sony did like official support for it, at least the hardware and stuff, until like 2009, 2010, I think it was. Or no, maybe it was like 2012. I think they actually ran a lot longer than that. Part of the reason it was able to go so long, other than just being a big success, is in Europe, Sony lost some sort of lawsuit. I read about this once. I only vaguely remember it, but they lost some sort of lawsuit that allowed anybody who wanted to make games in the European Union to just be able to do it, and Sony would, as long as they paid the basic publishing fee, Sony would have to put it on a disc. So it was able to survive much longer there than it was in North America or in Japan. Just because in North America and Japan, the interest just waned down completely. But in Europe, it was like, oh, this is the great way to put just cheap games out there. And when I say games, I use quotations, because a lot of the games that came out during that era were either like bad sports games, or they were like, a lot of them were by this company called Phoenix Games that made, they're not really games. The guy, it was like this one dude who was just making his own like really bad like animated movies, and he was just putting them on PS2 discs and then calling them misleading things. They were like strange crayon drawn Disney clones. They were just complete garbage. They're hysterical, but they're infamously bad. But yeah, so that was a thing. But that's how it ended. And in the middle, of course, was when it was at its peak, in the early 2000s, the early aughts, when it just was crushing everybody and just had massive, unbelievable success. I mean, obviously everyone has their own favorite PS2 game, and I hesitate to say one of mine because the thing with saying your favorite game is you always inevitably have people who just like crap on you for that. But I'm going to say it, even though I know it's probably not the best game on the system, but the one I certainly enjoyed the most was Twisted Metal Black. And that was just a nice callback to the fact that Twisted Metal, particularly Twisted Metal 2, was my favorite thing ever for PS1. So Twisted Metal Black was like the sequel we had never really gotten because Twisted Metal 3 and 4 were just complete garbage and whatever. And to be honest, we haven't had a real Twisted Metal game since. Twisted Metal Head-On was okay. I preferred the PS2 version, actually, over the PSP version. And we got that Twisted Metal reboot in 2012 for PS3, and I really did not like that. They just completely ripped the core out of it. And we have not seen, and probably will not see, a Twisted Metal game on PS4. Which bugs me, because Twisted Metal was... At one time, Sweet Tooth was like the PlayStation icon. Like, he was the Sonic. He was the Mario. He was the guy they threw out there because, and even in the ads for the PS3 game, Sony made a big deal about like he's going to be the only Sony-owned like day one mascot who's still around on every generation of PlayStation hardware. He had a game on everything, at the time anyway. PS1, PS2, PS3, PSP, but there is no Vita game. There certainly won't be. There is no PS4 game, and I can't imagine there would be at this late stage, and it doesn't seem like there's any interest in doing anything with them for PS5. So I'm sad to see that franchise go. But so in a sense, like all the way back in 2002, I guess it would have been. No, it would have been 2001. 2001 is when Twisted Metal Black came out. That, to me, as funny as it is, was the height of the PS2 for me, and it was like the last time I got to really enjoy the Twisted Metal franchise. After that, you obviously had a ton of games that came out, and I've got a ton of them, but that's just the one that sticks in my mind as like the one I will always remember as like my definitive game for that console. So, and I'm sure a lot of people will throw out there like, oh, the RPGs and all that stuff. Like, everybody's got their own favorite games. Everyone's got their own favorite games. So we're not even going to get into that argument. That's just my story. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing like what the future is with the PS2. When I say that, I mean from like obviously from the community, which is people working on HDMI boards and stuff. Because one thing that does suck about the PS2 is its video output is a joke. It's unbelievably bad. Of nearly 5,000 games, like less than like 180 support progressive scan modes. So almost every game runs at 480i, which looks horrific. Not just from a resolution standpoint, but the picture is unclear. The resolution is low. That has nothing to do with graphics. Graphics are fine. People don't understand these are three different concepts. But two of the three are garbage. At least with an HDMI mod, you might be able to clean up some of it and make it look more presentable on a modern television. So, yeah, it's sad because people be like, oh, but it's an old console. That makes sense. It's 20, dude. Why would you expect it to look good? Because all of its contemporary rivals do, and a lot of the consoles before it look do. It's in addition to a funky resolution now, 480i is rather funky. It wasn't at the time, I admit, but it's also just an unclear picture. So if you can solve any of that, I mean, come on, man. The internet's littered with people who are like, dude, I plugged my PS2 in, it just looks like horrible. It's like, yeah, that's just how the PS2 is. It was always like that. It's just we didn't really know any better. And when you're seeing it on CRT, a lot of it was more, muffled, if you will, and it just looked fine. But even if you go back and play on a CRT, while it will look better than what it will look like on a modern television, I promise you there's room for improvement. I'm hoping these HDMI mods are able to do that down the road. But there you go. PS2. It's 20. Go celebrate. Play a PS2 game. Moving on. The next subject is, we had to talk a little bit about Shenmue. There hasn't been much to say about Shenmue other than the fact that the new Shenmue 3 DLC is out. I've played one of them, that battle thing. I'm going to be totally real. Did not like that at all. And there's the new story mode DLC, which I unfortunately have not had a chance to play yet. But the other thing that was in the news about it was Shenmue 1 and 2 were on Xbox Game Pass, which are now coming off of Xbox Game Pass. Presumably their contract, whatever, expired. They're not renewing it for whatever reason. Now, personally, I don't use Xbox Game Pass. I don't care about it. Sorry, I keep hitting the mic. I don't care about digital streaming. I don't care about digital gaming in general, but this is one of those moments that I want to remind people out there. If you subscribe to something like Xbox Game Pass, don't forget, you don't own that. That is a rental service. You're able to access it. You have temporary permission to use a license to play the game. But don't think, oh man, I signed up for Xbox Game Pass, so I download all these games, I own them all now. No, you don't. They can be taken away from you at any time. That is a rental. If you consider that property, then what you have to do is argue that what they're doing is theft. Since no one would make that case, it's not really property. If you can't have it stolen from you, you never really owned it. And I know a lot of people don't care, and that's fine if you don't care. What I don't like is when people go into it thinking they're buying something, not understanding that they're just renting it. That's what I don't like about it. And so it's just a reminder in this instance that this can happen to anything digital. Anything digital that's dependent upon a service, you are handing over your right of ownership to a corporation and just hoping that license issues never get in the way, which is ridiculous because license issues always get in the way. So yeah, Shenmue 1 and 2 are coming off of Game Pass, along with, I think there's a Deus Ex Machina game that's coming off there and some other stuff. But that's a thing. It happens with video streaming services, music services, and of course game services are no exception. So, keep vigilant. Now, of course, with these games, you can get these physically. But, that's the thing with video games, man. And it's going to get worse as time goes on because there's going to be more and more games that are only coming out digitally and eventually only through streaming services that will just vanish into the ethos for all time. So enjoy them while you can, I guess. Next up, this is just a blurb because I haven't actually had a chance to see it. Speaking of digital streaming, Disney Plus just put out Star Wars Clone Wars Season 7. I've unfortunately not had the chance to see it, but I want to. The thing that's cool about this, though, is I'm going to give this the elevator pitch of what happened with this. Star Wars Clone Wars was kind of holding the torch of Star Wars after Revenge of the Sith. Like, George was done making movies. He didn't want to make them anymore. But before the Disney acquisition, the only thing that was keeping Star Wars in the public media was this show through Warner Brothers Animation called Clone Wars. Or at least Warner Brothers was doing distribution. Lucasfilm was doing animation. So that was what was being produced. They did 5 complete seasons, and then in the middle of production of the 6th season in 2012, George sold off Lucasfilm to Disney. Disney immediately canceled production on the show. There was like 13 episodes that were basically done. They allowed those to be finished and then released on a Blu-ray set, as well as like the Lost season or something like that. But the story was incomplete because they had run out of time. It wasn't meant to end on the 6th season, much less halfway through the 6th season. Disney had decided they wanted to do their own thing, and they didn't want to share any part of it with Warner Brothers, which I guess makes sense from a corporate standpoint, but not from a story standpoint. There was a lot of arrogance behind the Disney acquisition that they are now paying the price for, because they've made a lot of really bad decisions with Star Wars. And this is one of those decisions they made in an effort to win back some of the fans. There was a lot of demand to let Clone Wars Season 7 get resolved. Now, it's funny, there were actually a few, I think it was 7 episodes of Season 7 were actually released years ago in like animatic form, which everybody said those are canon, they count. Even Disney said, yeah, they count even though they're incomplete. I think now those would have been wiped out. I don't know if those are the same storylines they ultimately decided to actually use for the new Season 7. It's all so confusing, isn't it? But, yeah, so anyway, so they decided to release this in an effort to basically placate fans, make us not as angry, because after things like The Last Jedi and everything, everybody was just super, super mad at them. So they rolled out some of the storylines. It's funny, actually, if you ever see Star Wars Rebels, it was made by a lot of the same people who did Clone Wars, including Dave Filoni. He actually used Rebels to complete a lot of the storylines of Clone Wars that he thought would never get resolved. He even said that on stage at Star Wars Celebration. And so when he was finally given the green light, hey, go back and finish Clone Wars properly, he was like, okay, that's a little stressful because now I have to fit a gap between Clone Wars and I have to end Revenge of the Sith, because that would be the next movie that it takes place. But I also can't resolve a whole bunch of storylines because I know they get resolved in the Rebels show that takes place like 20 years later. So it's like it was a lot to that. And I think I haven't seen it yet again, but based on the trailers, it looks like the goal is to focus on Ahsoka Tano, because the last time you see her in Clone Wars, she has resigned from the Jedi Order, and she's just gone. And then when Revenge of the Sith comes around, she has nothing to do with that. And she's also not killed by Anakin. And then you find out in Rebels that, she survived and was more or less in hiding all this time. So I assume a good chunk of it will be about like where she went and what she did, because I think that's like one of the only avenues you could really take. But yeah, I guess we'll see. I mean, a lot of you probably already have seen it, so looking forward to checking that out. Now, moving on. There is a certain I'm not going to call it a disease, but it's uses 2 letters, CV, which I apparently am not allowed to say on YouTube. I did not know that, but you can't. And I just want to talk a little bit about it. Aside from like take care of yourselves and all that stuff, what it's actually been doing in the gaming industry and the effects it's been having in the short term and potentially long term. The first thing I want to announce is there was a convention in Toronto that I was supposed to guest at in 2 months from now in May. It was gonna be in the middle of May. I was invited. It was all set. We even publicly announced it was all good to go. But because of CV, they have decided to scale this down substantially because they're expecting very low attendance. It's possible they may even cancel the convention altogether. So as a result, I will not be attending this convention. They just decided to cut all the guests, which is unfortunate, especially because they had a whole bunch lined up, but I was, I think, the only one they had announced at that point. So whatever, I'm announcing it. I will not be going unless something changes with that. I'd still love to go, but CV is presenting that for a lot of people. And this isn't just like some, just a retro game convention in Toronto. This is having a worldwide effect. TwitchCon Amsterdam was completely shut down and canceled because of this. GDC was indefinitely delayed due to this. It's becoming a real thing. And it's amazing the effect it's having not only in the video game industry but every industry. I fly so much that my phone thinks I'm a flight attendant, so I get like newsletters all the time from various airlines and things like that. You'd be stunned how many airlines are just like hemorrhaging money from this, and how many of them are just canceling certain routes just to stop the bleeding. Like almost every American airline is no longer flying to most of Asia. Like none of them are flying to China, and I think some of them are still doing like instead of like daily service to Tokyo, they're doing like Tokyo like once every 3 or 4 days or something like that, just because they're like there's just not enough demand to justify those flights. And so now they have a ton of like jumbo jet aircraft just sitting on the ground doing nothing. And the thing with jumbo jet aircraft is when they're sitting on the ground, they're just costing you money, because when they're in the air, at least they're producing funds, but when they're sitting there, it's just eating up maintenance and storage fees and insurance and everything. But they don't make money on the ground. All they do is lose it. So yeah, you got a lot of, we'll see what, there might actually be a lot of airlines that go out of business in this. This is going to be a massive drain on the economy. It has had huge effects on the stock market already, but it's also affecting production. So we're getting to a point now where it's starting to affect, because obviously, as we all know, everything is made in China, but nobody's taking stuff from China right now because of this incident and because nobody in China is working. There's probably people working, but like I'm saying is people aren't taking their imports. So there's one very direct story about that, which we're going to talk about now, which is the TurboGrafx 16 Mini was delayed due to this. They actually can't produce the units because they can't get them made and guarantee like a clean work environment. And I don't care about the TG16 Mini, to be completely real with you, but it's just a symbol of what's happening there. And just apply this to everything. Stuff is not being built. And the same goes for a lot of different aspects of not only the video game industry, but the industry in general. I've heard the same rumor floating around that Sony and Microsoft might have to push back the release of both PS5 and Xbox Series X because they can't get enough units built in time because of this situation. It's weird, man. And I know there was some there's some new retro console devices. I'm not supposed to say which. There was one that was sent to me, and I was like, they were like, hey, do a review when you get the chance. And it would have happened relatively soon, but then I got the message saying, don't do it yet. Production on this thing can't go forward because of CV. So it's just, we don't know when it's going to resume. You just don't do the video yet. It's like, okay, you got it. So I have one of the very few of this one particular thing that I can't talk about yet, but yeah, this is a cascading effect that will not only affect video games but production in general. The only upswing here is the last couple of years there's been a lot of talk about US tariffs on Chinese products. So those tariffs would take effect at a certain point. So a lot of companies, what they were doing was overproducing in China to beat that tariff date. So that way they would have excess amount of supplies. So ironically, that might actually come to be beneficial now, because there might be a lot of companies that are like, well, we can't get new stuff made, but because of this other thing, we actually have enough stuff for a while. So there might be a bunch of places that end up being fine. But I think a lot of the people who didn't panic about the tariffs, ironically, will now be panicking about CV because they can't get stuff produced. At the time they had to pressure, didn't think it would actually happen, and now they will have no choice but to not have stuff produced. Economics is fun, isn't it, everybody? But anyway, so I think that's enough of that. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed all this, and stay safe out there with the whole CV thing. Seriously, wash your hands frequently. Try not to touch as much stuff if you don't have to. Use some hand sanitizer. Don't use those face masks. They don't do anything, and you're just preventing people in the medical industry from being able to do their job because there's not enough of those things in stock. Don't forget, can't produce more of them, at least for now. So try not to go out and buy those, and take things like Airborne, boost your immune system, do stuff like that. Just be smart, be safe, be clean, and hopefully that'll help out. But we'll see. There's gonna be some serious economic ramifications from this, because essentially the entire economic engine is grinding to a halt, and when something grinds to a halt, it grinds everything else to a halt. Think of it like almost like a car crash. Like, you can have a speeding highway, and then this one big car accident in front causes a traffic jam all the way back. Even if all the way the people in the back were not hit in any way, shape, or form physically by the car accident, they're still affected by it. That's how economics basically works. It needs to be a constant stream of activity, otherwise everybody gets affected. So hopefully you guys got some cash in the bank. All right, that's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Appreciate you. And if possible, go over to the Patreon, support the podcast, get new early access to stuff. Check out the Instagram, Twitter, everything else out over there. I think it's Facebook link in there. And my Discord. I haven't talked about the Discord in a long time. Please check all that stuff out. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you all later.